This episode of the .NET Core podcast is brought to you in part by RJJ Software. RJJ Software is dedicated to helping you realize your company's digital potential through innovative solutions using the latest technologies. Utilizing the latest in .NET and cloud technologies, we can help you build the solution your business needs on time and under budget. We have world-class experience in cross-platform development using the latest iterations of the Microsoft technology stack. This includes .NET Core, SQL Server, and Azure. Is Azure not your thing? That's fine, because we have experience in AWS, GCP, Linode, and DigitalOcean too. We know what it means to have to be able to iterate quickly and how important DevOps practices are when it comes to remaining agile. As such, we have experts in the major build and release pipelines, from Azure DevOps to AWS, from Netlify to Travis CI, AppVeyor, and everything in between. So get in touch today at rjj-software.co.uk or check the show notes for a link. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Gaprogman Taylor, and this is episode 53, The Desktop Story with Paul Michaels. In this episode, I interviewed Paul about the Windows-based desktop development story using .NET Core. You may know Paul from his blog, pmmichaels.net, his Twitter account, @Paul_Michaels, or his new book, C# 8 and .NET Core 3 projects using Azure 2nd edition. One thing to note about this episode is that the interview was recorded in advance of MS Build 2020. At MS Build, a greatly updated version of the WinForms Designer was released, along with things like WinUI updates and the announcement of MAUI, that's the Multi-Platform Application User Interface. As such, some of the points about the WinForms Designer in this episode are based on an old version of it. With that being said, let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET U Podcast, and let the show begin. So the first thing I'd like to say, Paul, is thank you ever so much for agreeing to be on the show. We're actually doing this on a Saturday afternoon, which, if you're anything like me, then, Saturday afternoon's kind of a lovely time to just rest up or watch TV shows or, spend time with family and friends. Or if you are me, spend time in your basement recording an interview with someone who's pretty amazing at their job.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to come on. I'm a long-time listener, so thanks for that.
Hey, no worries. So you're a long-time listener, first-time caller, as they would say.
Yep, exactly that, yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So for the folks who are listening in who may not know about you, could you give us a quick sort of brief introduction to like who you are, the kind of work you do, that kind of stuff?
Yep. So I'm Paul Michaels. I'm a lead developer. I work at a large company and predominantly sort of work in sort of the web sphere. So, your bog standard MVC type applications, bit of React, and so on and so forth. One of the things that sort of driven me to sort of seek you out and come on here is to talk about the upgrade to .NET Core 3 and some of the interesting things that's happening in the desktop sphere. I don't tend to do a lot of desktop development now, so it's quite interesting to kind of go back and sort of, I don't know if you ever saw Bullseye in the 80s, but it's like what you could have had if this had been around then. So, that's something that's kind of interesting me at the minute.
Just for the, the international listeners and the youngsters among the audience, Bullseye was a quiz show, but it had a twist in that they had professional darts players would sort of play darts for you and, score a bunch of points and you had to answer questions. But the thing you hinted at there was that the quizmaster would ask the questions, the person would answer them, and if they failed, or if they chose a different prize, he would say, let's have a look at what you could have won. And it was invariably a speedboat, and they were always someone who lived landlocked.
Yeah, I'd love to see them speedboats now and see what state they're in.
There are a few at the end of my street, if I'm honest. I don't live in a particularly wonderful neighborhood, but there are some speedboats in like a trash heap towards the end of my street, which is an interesting sight every day.
Speedboat graveyard.
That's the one, yeah. But yeah, okay, so we're going to talk about .NET Core 3, desktop-y things, web stuff, perhaps if we can touch on that. It's not a problem if we don't. But what's really interesting is that about 4 or 5 years ago, I was being interviewed for a role, and they said to me, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I said, well, I've just come from at the time, I'd just come from almost like a research and development role where we were doing WinForm stuff. And I said, I want to investigate more desktop things, maybe create some cross-platform desktop stuff. And they kind of looked at me and went, what? The future's the web. What are you talking about? And, for a number of years, it has been the web. .NET itself, the .NET framework was originally called NGWS, which stands for Next Gen Web Services. So they knew back in the late 90s that everything was going web. But you're saying that there is a desktop story for .NET Core?
Yeah, I think everything went web kind of for a good reason, or for good reasons. And there's a few of them, not least of which was deployment. One of the big, if you've ever tried to actually write a piece of desktop software, one of the biggest challenges you come across is how do you actually get that from where it's been written to your sort of client's machine. And that's always been difficult, to say the least. And the web just solves that, because you get on Chrome and you type in a URL and suddenly your software's there and it's running, and you've not got anything to install or anything to do. And I think Windows have tried to solve that. Microsoft have tried to solve that in the past, pretty much taking the Apple model of, we've got these kind of kosher apps that we know there's nothing wrong with them. You can download them from a store. And I think some of the stuff that we're moving towards now with the upgrade, they've got this the concept of this MSIX. So essentially, it's it feels a bit like they've taken the best parts of Click Once, and they've sort of moved it over to this MSIX process, and that's a really nice deployment experience. I've sort of been having a look into that a little bit, and there's quite a lot you can do with it, and interestingly, you don't have to sort of go down the store route. So you can, if you've got private customers, you can kind of just package everything up as MSIX, and it works really well.
Okay, yeah, I kind of agree with you on that, because, like I said, when I was working this research and development WinForms place, they did industrial hardware testing. So there's a standard out there called the Zigbee standard, which is what your sort of like your Philips Hue lights use. And they built a bunch of hardware to test that. But to test that, you needed, it was a very manual process, and you would send some bytes, read the bytes back, and then measure it with an oscilloscope and stuff like that. So we wrote some desktop applications that would essentially run the tests that would take maybe 3 or 4 hours to do manually in a number of seconds, which was amazing. And it would interpret the results and tell you whether it passed or failed, and then give you the actual raw data, which was useful. But I remember having to write, oh dear, it was the install shield scripting, that's what it was. And I had to write a whole script to develop the installation package, and package up all of the drivers, and make sure the right version of .NET Framework was installed, and then install it all into the known paths. It took a good couple of days just to sort of get my head around how all of that worked. And then invariably someone would say, oh hey, we've been sold the software and we only run Linux at the shop, how do we use it?
Yeah, it's an hard problem, and there's been a few things. Install Shield, was it Wix that kind of cropped up at one point? They were trying to solve it as well. So it's a difficult problem.
That's before you even factor into the whole equation that different operating systems have different window managers and different, not necessarily APIs, but the way that the UI is displayed is different based on the window manager. So my Pop! OS Linux machine in my office is based on Ubuntu, and it runs a GNOME shell, which means that everything is different on Windows, but it's a superficial difference, but it's different enough that like a WinForms app will not work, because WinForms cannot be ported to Linux or macOS, presumably, because it's just a thin wrapper around the Windows 32 API. So everything gets a bit all wobbly when you try to do cross-platform desktop, right?
Yeah, it is. One of the restrictions, I think, when they when they upgraded to Netcore 3, they sort of said, yeah, we'll run, your WinForms and your WPF apps, but we'll only run them on Windows, kind of obviously, because it's all sort of directed at Windows. Interesting, with the new sort of WinUI stuff that's coming out, it looks like they're sort of heading towards a cross-platform experience. And they're apparently teaming up with the guys at Uno. I don't know if you've come across that. I've really got very sketchy knowledge of it myself, but it looks like, yeah, they sort of using that to sort of allow you to run WinUI, and it looks like they're piggybacking that onto WebAssembly. So you'll be able to, well, this is sort of me predicting the future, but you'll be able to kind of write a XAML application and it'll just run anywhere you want it to run, just by the magic of WebAssembly. So
that is interesting. Obviously, I just want to point out, I usually do this when people sort of predict stuff on the podcast, is that is obviously your opinion based on, a bunch of stuff that you've looked into. This is not the direction that Microsoft are going in. I'm not a Microsoft employee. As far as I know, Paul isn't a Microsoft employee.
I am definitely not, no.
Yeah, so it's just conjecture at this point. The reason I do that is because early in the show's history, someone had predicted something, and then there were blog posts about the sky is falling, and it got all the way up to Scott Hunter, who I was actually watching a keynote he was delivering at a conference, and he went, yes, I know about that podcast, and yes, I know about the blog posts. So my guess is he's never going to be on this show, but that's, small loss, I suppose.
If I'd have known that, I could have predicted something more ridiculous.
Yeah, well, let's predict really outlandish stuff.
But yeah, I have no knowledge of this, but sort of read a couple of things, and it seems like that's the way they're going. Certainly on Microsoft's GitHub site, they do sort of mention that they're working with the guys at Uno. It is conjecture, but I think the one XAML, if you like, I don't know if that's the way they're going to phrase it, but the idea that, you can write XAML and you can run it anywhere, that seems to be where they want to go. And I'm pretty sure I've heard some guys at Microsoft say that. Whether they were conjecting or not, I'm not sure. I mean, obviously in this day and age, writing software that just runs in one place is kind of not cutting it. So
yeah, I totally agree. I do remember that there was an experiment. It's always worth watching. People like Steve Sanderson, he was experimenting with a cross-platform UI based entirely on his work with Blazor. He'd managed to package in, I think it was a headless Chromium or something like that, into his app, which then drew a window based on the APIs available for the platform that you're running. And then he could do basic WinForms stuff because of doing WebAssembly. And I think it's probably similar to what you were saying, this whole let's play with WebAssembly and see what we can do with it, which is, it's exciting times.
Yeah, I think WebAssembly has definitely got some mileage in it. And I'd also class that as a form of desktop software, because it is ultimately it's downloading stuff to your machine and running it on your machine. So you're still in a sandbox, but it's arguably it is a type of desktop software. So you've got nobody would really say it in the same breath as WinForms and WPF. I mean, certainly when you put this stuff on your CV, you don't go, oh yeah, I've got experience of WinForms, WPF and WebAssembly. You leave the first two off. But
yeah,
I think they do sort of belong in the same sort of category, because you are running it locally, and it does give you some sort of mileage that you don't get from, if you were running it as WebAssembly on the server, or if you were running just a bog standard, MVC app or whatever. It's that's all kind of going over the wire constantly. If you've got something on your machine, you can do a lot of processing. I've seen examples of games and stuff that have been running WebAssembly, and it's quite amazing the stuff that's sort of coming out. So yeah, it's impressive and it's exciting.
Yeah. One of my keen interests is video games and web stuff and programming. And I remember that there was the first example that I saw of a video game using WebAssembly was the sequel Mr. Magoo's version of Tetris using Blazor, which was called Bletris, which I thought, hey, this is pretty cool. This is a nice little diversion, and it works cross-platform. Doesn't matter which browser you're running on, it works. But then the best one I've seen so far is, do you remember the old PC game Diablo?
No, I don't.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, it's a top-down. I think my friend G from my other podcast described it as a top-down clicky looter shooter, which is fair enough. But yeah, the entire game runs in WebAssembly inside of your browser. I think it's Diablo. I'll get the URL and put it in the show notes, but it's like Diablo.webassembly.azure websites or something like that. You have to supply your browser with the data files from an actual, a pucker version of the game, as it were, an official, like maybe from GOG or from the CDs or whatever. But yeah, you provide it with the official data files for the game, and it's got the engine rewritten in WebAssembly, just sat there in your browser. It's genius, is what it is.
Excellent. They just need to do that for like Civilization or something, and we're going.
That's it. All of these older games, you can just run them inside your browser. The one I'm waiting for is Age of Empires, because I don't want to have to keep rebooting into Windows to play that, because I'm more of a Linux user these days. I've got a family member saying to me, how can I run Command and Conquer on Windows 10? And there is no way to run it on Windows 10 until somebody really smarter than I, figures out how to run it in WebAssembly, which is, it's going to happen. It just takes time.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
So you're saying that with .NET Core 3, you mentioned it earlier on, we can do WinFormsy stuff and WPF and things like that, but only on Windows, right?
Yep, that's right, yeah.
Okay, so I think I've seen it before. There's a demonstration that Scott Hunter did where he, hopefully if I say his name enough times on the show, he'll be on the show, right?
Yeah, it's like if you say it 3 times, he appears. Like Beetlejuice.
That's it, Beetlejuice. I was going to go with Bloody Mary, but okay, Beetlejuice, that's fine. I'm sure he'll prefer that comparison than Bloody Mary. But yeah, I've seen this talk that Hunter and Hanselman gave where Hunter said, it was a Westwind application, which tells you just how old it is. For those who don't know, that's, the fake company that Microsoft used to use before they came up with Contoso. So this was, .NET 1 stuff with WinForms. And he started it up, and it took a couple of seconds to start, and it wasn't very scalable. And then he went, and now I'll just change this 2 or 3 lines of code, make it work with .NET Core 3, and voila, there it is. And it's faster, and it's scalable, and all that kind of stuff. So I like that it's there. It just, I feel like it's more of a stepping stone until, like you say, until we figure out what we're going to do with cross-platform UIs for desktop applications.
Well, so the upgrade process is quite a nice process. I mean, like, as you've just described, there's a few ways of doing that. You can sort of just change the project that you're in, but Microsoft have got some recommendations, and you can do a side by side. I mean, I think this is aimed at people who've got, say, a WinForms app, and it's been there since, I don't know, 2003 or something, and it's running some important software that doesn't warrant a rewrite. And they only want to run it on Windows. And to be fair, if you go around the enterprise, there's a lot of people still running these kind of apps that, they don't really want to touch them because they just kind of work, and they've been working, and everybody knows how to use them. And so everyone's just left them until now. And I think this kind of story is a really nice way to kind of bring them kicking and screaming into the sort of 21st century. So it's, and especially, with the sort of other little things that are going on, like gRPC and so on. So, if you've got an old WPF app that's using WCF or something like that, and was it Mark Rendell that's written some library that'll automatically migrate all of your WCF over to gRPC, and so it's a week's worth of work, and you can bring this stuff into the 21st century, and you can have the speed improvements from .NET Core. That's a big factor.
It certainly is, yeah. So the tool that Mark Rendell has created is called Visual Recode. When I interviewed him in October 2019, he was saying it gets you kind of 60 to 70% of the way there in your migration in some time. I can't say how far, how long, because it will depend on the complexity of your app. But yeah, it can get you 60 to 70% of the way through a migration, which is incredibly useful, because I think it was Richard Campbell who said, working code has infinitely more value than experimental, I haven't written it yet code. And like you say, in these enterprise environments, you've got these applications that are, business level applications that need to be there. They're business critical. You can't do the TPS reports or whatever without this application, and nobody really understands how the code works, and the original source code may have been lost, and it's just there. You just run it, you fill it in, you hope it doesn't throw an exception, and you carry on. But then, like you say, if someone wants to bring it to .NET Core and make it faster or make it a little safer or anything like that, if you still have the source code, it's a case of making a few small changes and away you go.
Yeah, and also I'd sort of mention XAML Islands at that point, because that sort of lets you change the software from the outside in. So you can make a small change for, I don't know, say you've got Nuclear Reactor or whatever and a WinForms app that's running this Nuclear Reactor, so you don't want to touch it or whatever. So you add a form in WinForms and you add the XAML host, and then you can start adding stuff using XAML Islands written in sort of WinUI. Then effectively you can sort of develop the application without changing it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I really, really do hope that there's no actual nuclear reactors that are running WinForm apps, but the principle's there. It's like, you're frightened to change it because it's going to break something, and you can make these changes outside of the application and then just see them reflected in the application. So yeah, it's really nice. And I suppose, I can't remember who it was. It might have been Martin Fowler who's talking about a strangling vines pattern. So he was talking about, you write tests and you can kind of shore something up with tests, and then you can kind of change it from within, and these strangling vines of tests sort of hold it up. Well, it sort of feels like the same sort of thing. You can sort of make these changes inside this sort of XAML host and keep it running as it did, but have this thing sort of by the side and sort of enhance it in that way. And at the end, you might just be left with a sort of WinForms shell, but nothing in it is left of WinForms, and it's all been sort of migrated. And at that point, it's a relatively low risk change to just go, well, we're going to stop using the WinForms shell and now plug in a WinUI shell, and we're good to go.
Yeah, definitely. It's that strangler pattern. The idea if you build an API or an interface around the working existing code, and you code against that interface until you're able to change the code underneath it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and then like you say, you get to the point where you're able to change that code without having to worry about breaking everything else, which is incredibly useful. So what other elements do we have in the desktop story for .NET Core? There isn't yet a fully cross-compatible UI framework, but we're here with WinForms and WCF and stuff, right? So like the way that I've understood it is being able to do WinForms and WCF on .NET Core 3. Now this is my understanding, obviously. What I've inferred from the documentation and the press releases and stuff is that it's similar to the kind of step that everyone was expected to take with .NET Core 2.1, in that ASP.NET Core 2.1 can run on either .NET Core or Framework. In that, if you have something that already runs on Framework, you can make a bunch of small changes and migrate either a small controller over or a small bunch of features over. Or you can just blanket move everything over to .NET Core, which, if you have that much hair to pull out, then good luck to you.
During the upgrade process, you can, you can't do the piecemeal thing. So you're on Framework or you're on Core, because it's the actual project that gets upgraded. Ultimately, you've got to change the target of the project. What you can do is you can create a new .NET Core WinForms app, say, and you can do that, say, in the same directory as the existing Framework WinForms app, and then you can just point it to all the same files. So if you change one, it'll change both. So you can run them side by side, and you can also, if you didn't want to do that, you could set up some symbolic links across. But essentially, you're just sharing the same code between the two environments, because the idea is they both run the same code. There's one or two exceptions to that, which don't leap to mind at the minute, so I can't give you any examples. But when you do get an exception, what you can do is you can put in a quick compiler directive check, so hash if whatever, and then sort of say, if we're running on .NET Core, then do X, and otherwise do Y. Although having worked with them kind of things in C 15, 20 years ago, you don't want too many of them in your code, because it can become spaghettified.
Yeah, they end up kind of like a code smell, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, one or two you can live with, but yeah, if you see a code base that's got, every other line is like, if we're running as this, then do X, and otherwise do Y. You just can't kind of run that through in your head. It's just too many variables.
Totally agree. I do like the idea of taking, back when I was not employed to do WinForms applications, I was, sort of noodling around with them, and everything happened in that single thread, and everything was in a single class, and all that kind of stuff. But if you are able to then go back and architect your application, split out your UI layer from your business logic, and make it almost like an N-tier architecture layer application, and then you should then be able to just swap the UI out, and it shouldn't really matter.
Yeah, absolutely, and arguably you probably should be doing that anyway. I mean, the one thing that .NET Core 3 has not done is introduce the idea that it's good to sort of separate your code into sort of business logic and UI logic. It's UI layer. That's sort of always been there. So I mean, for WPF, it's sort of, I don't want to say built in, but it's sort of quite easy to do, because you can sort of bind. You can use data binding, and then you can sort of use an MVVM pattern, or I want to use the term MVVM Lite, so you can. I don't mean the piece of software MVVM Lite, but you can sort of do parts of MVVM. With WinForms, obviously you're a bit limited. There's other patterns that you can use with WinForms to sort of emulate that kind of binding, but you obviously don't get a smoother experience for that. But you can still separate your business logic from your UI layer, and obviously if you've got a load of code behind, if you've got like, you press a button on a form and it's like on click, and then there's 5,000 lines of code that do some incredibly complicated thing, then you're in trouble no matter what framework you're running on.
Not gonna lie, you've given me some horrendous flashbacks just then. But that's how we were sort of before these N-tier patterns and separating everything out and interfaces and stuff. I mean, they've always been there in computer science since like 1991, 1992, I think, since the Gang of Five. But when you're throwing together what is an MVP for an application, and it's only ever doing one thing. It's doing what I call the Charles Emerson Winchester Gambit. It does one thing, does it very well, and then it moves on. Then yeah, you can kind of get away with lumping all the code into the code behind. I don't think anyone who doesn't watch MASH would get that reference. But what I'm getting at is that when you're originally putting the application together, I think doing it that way kind of makes sense. But then over time it gets bloated, doesn't it? All application code bases get bloated.
Yeah, I mean, every application that's ever been written was only supposed to do like the one thing that you've just described, and then they suddenly end up doing 50 different things, and nobody saw that when it was first developed. I mean, WinForms was a classic one for sort of being built from prototypes. So, you go out to a client and you'd say, yeah, we can do this, and look, there's a button here, and if we press that and it does this, and so on and so forth. And then, 8 months down the line, you've got all the code behind that button to kind of make the salesman's story kind of work. and nobody ever wants to separate it, because it's like, well, am I going to be the one that's going to refactor that? So that's how these things start, innit? So
yeah, that's it. And then you get to a point where you're talking to maybe your project manager or delivery manager or someone who's more senior than you, and saying this needs to be changed from the 500-line behemoth to something a little bit more scalable, or a little bit, it needs to be moved off the UI thread or something. And they're saying it's not worth it because it doesn't give us any kind of new features.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's one of the issues with sprints, in it, that you'll sort of, at the end of it, nobody wants to see the exact thing that they saw at the start of the sprint, but you telling them now it's more maintainable.
Yeah, you're right. I do remember there was it was actually a real world example from one of my earlier roles. I was instructed, build a demo application. It doesn't do anything. It starts up, it has a data grid, you push a button, it fakes running some process and dumps some random data out into the data grid. And we're going to use that to sort of almost win a contract, So I threw it together in maybe a few hours, tried to architect it roughly well so that then I could swap out parts as it became available. A couple hours later, I was like, there you go, boss. The boss went away and did whatever they did. And then, 6 months later, once it had been done and dusted and I'd completely forgotten about it, no one had remembered about it, I got a bug report saying that it wasn't actually running a test. So, yeah, not only had they used it to secure some work, but they just basically handed over the executable as soon as they'd secured the work.
Excellent.
Yeah. So that, trying to explain to this customer, I'll actually have to build the application.
It's not working. That's because it's not there.
That's it. But that was always the great thing about WinForms is that, for those who haven't used it before, it's brilliant. You bring up a WinForms designer inside of Visual Studio and you literally have a toolbox of components. So there's a button, there's a text box, there's a number box, there's an IP address box. You just drag and drop them onto this form, this window. And if you want the button to do something, you double click it and it will generate the event and tie all of that code together. So then you just get a method that is already existing and already tied together. You just write your code in there. It's brilliant for that rapid application development model, but in my opinion, not that great for long-term survival.
No, I mean, I think it's called the MVP pattern that you can use. I think stands for Model View Presenter, and it's sort of a way of sort of shoehorning WinForms into a sort of, for want of a better word, MVVM style sort of architecture. But yeah, it is quick for prototyping. I think that's sort of where it came from. It came from the sort of VB5, VB6 type ethos of Microsoft's idea of let's just give this to accountants or whatever, and they can sort of build their own software and off you go, because it's dead simple. You just drag and drop and then your piece of data is there and so on and so forth. But obviously, the price you pay for that is it's really difficult to maintain.
Like you say, it's from the Visual Basic world and the Visual Basic for Applications world and all of that stuff where, you give the tools to the people they're the domain experts. It was that idea of trying to make development sort of democratized, I guess. That whole give everyone the tools and they'll make brilliant software as long as our software that it sits on is brilliant. And then, you'd be given some kind of jumbled mess of VBA code and told, make that better. And you have no idea what it's doing because, there's no kind of patterns or anything that you would expect a developer to use because they weren't developers.
That's true, yeah. The WinForms designer has actually been, I don't know if it's been ported, but there is a WinForms designer you can now use for the .NET Core sort of story. But to be honest, it's quite an early release, and in my sort of playing with it, I think you're 15 minutes away from it just kind of crashing on you, and it does quite nasty things. So you've got a few controls on a form, and then you drag another one, and if it doesn't like it, it just kind of deletes all the controls and gives up and goes home. So it will be good, I'm sure, but it's not now.
I guess, though, that's par for the course, isn't it? It's like a early release V1 of something. There's a reason why a lot of developers stick around for V2 of something.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just, given that you've got this sort of story, it's one of the prices that you're going to pay, especially if you're on a WinForms app, is that in order to edit the UI, you're going to have to go into the designer file and you're going to have to change that stuff in code, which it's possible to do, but it's certainly not as easy as to do it in WinForms as it is in, say, WPF or even in WinUI.
Sure. I do remember talking to one of my friends who's an old school Windows developer, and he said, back in the days of Windows 3.1, you essentially had to handcraft your UI, and you had like a text file with a bunch of numbers essentially, and you change one of the numbers and the UI stops working and you don't know why, and then you undo it and it starts working again, which is wonderful.
It reminds me of the time I spent programming Spectrum, and you sort of write all this code out from a book, and then a line wouldn't work, so you just kind of go up and delete that line because it was moaning about it, and then, oh no, the next line's not working.
Exactly, right? You're literally hacking away to get the application running, sort of thing, yeah. So let's say I wanted to create a brand new, let's say WinForms .NET Core 3 app. Is it relatively easy? Is it the same process as if I was using Framework? Is it just file a new project inside of Visual Studio, that kind of thing?
It is, yeah. It is an easy process. Like I say, you're going to quickly come up against the limitations of the designer, because you're going to need the designer on your machine to sort of drag your various bits and bobs on. And very quickly, I think, I was sort of playing about with it, and I managed to get about 4 or 5 controls on before it started doing strange stuff, and I sort of gave up and said, right, okay, this is causing more harm than good. But yeah, it's still just file new project, and you've got a WinForms app running. There's an interesting question as to what criteria would be for creating a WinForms app in sort of 2020. There are some arguments to say that it seems to be faring better than WPF does, because when they fix the WinForms designer problem, you've still got that kind of quick drag and drop, and with your XAML islands, you could arguably just run it as a shell. But yeah, there is a question as to whether you'd want to create a new WinForms application in this day and age.
We talked earlier on about the enterprise, and I guess, the enterprise is kind of slow moving, and if somebody there says we want you to create a WinForms app, you can now, I guess, with the newer tools.
Yeah, absolutely. And arguably, you can, like I say, just run it as a shell, and then it sort of satisfies the whatever policy it is that means that, somebody's told you to create a WinForms app.
Regardless of whether that's a good thing or not, but the thing is, it gets the work done, doesn't it? The idea is that I've said it a few times, this RAD idea, rapid application development. This idea of quickly prototyping something. You said MVP pattern, and I thought minimum viable product pattern. That's kind of what it means.
Yeah, it doesn't stand for that, but yeah, I see what you mean. It is a quick way of getting something running, and if all you want is a button, and it, I've seen a few WinForms apps where they are just a button, and they call out to a service somewhere, and that's all they do. And then maybe that is what you want. Maybe you want a WinForms application. There's a lot to be said for running a desktop application. I mean, you've got zero latency as long as you're not actually leaving the application. You've got zero latency. You've got a really fast experience because it's running on your desktop. No one's kind of spoofing the button that you're pressing, because again, it's on your desktop. So there's quite a lot of stuff that you get sort of out of the box just running WinForms or any sort of desktop application, because it's running locally. I can sort of see an argument for certain applications being either of them technologies. I'm not saying I'd advise generally people to go, oh yeah, ditch React and and write that as a WinForms app, but there are reasons for doing it. I can imagine there'd be and not just that there's some strange policy that says we can only create WinForms apps, but it's interesting. And I did a similar sort of talk to this at a local user group, and at the end I was sort of saying, so how many people are creating desktop applications? And I expected, maybe one guy to put his hand up. It was about half the room put their hand up. And I was sort of saying, all right, how many people have created WinForms applications? And again, maybe half of them. So it does happen, and people are using this technology still.
Like I said, the enterprise is a bit of a slow beast. It moves very slowly because, it kind of has to. Because if it doesn't move slowly, then the code that we wrote last year needs to be rewritten, kind of thing. And I could totally get behind that. It's an interesting setup when you realize that, the majority of the world runs on incredibly old code that was kind of hacked together at the last possible minute. Like, I shudder to think of how many of the behind closed doors banking, how much of that industry is actually running on old COBOL that was written by someone 30, 40, 50 years ago who is now probably since passed on, but didn't document it and hasn't commented it at all, and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of crazy and scary to think about that kind of things.
There was an advert, and I can't remember whether it might have been Fortran, and they were advertising it for a Hubble telescope, and they were sort of saying we need a Fortran developer, because we had this guy and he's done Fortran and that's it, and now he's retired, and now we need somebody to kind of maintain this telescope. I'm sure I heard about that relatively recently, and they were sort of looking for, I don't know, the last Fortran developer left.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And if you want to make loads and loads of money,
Yeah, learn an obscure language, and somebody will pay you money to keep something going.
don't use this podcast as a way of getting career advice, because I don't even know what I'm doing with my career, so I can't advise people on this. So we originally connected because we were talking about you'd written with some co-authors a book recently. I believe it's on Pact Publishing. Did you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so actually, I didn't write it with co-authors. I wrote the second edition of it. So there's a couple of guys wrote the first edition, and I sort of took it and sort of gutted it. It was originally written for .NET Core 2 and C# 7. So the title of the book that I've released is C# 8 and .NET Core projects using Azure. So I've essentially upgraded it and sort of added some new stuff. And pretty much every chapter except for the first one is using something on Azure. So that they sort of added that in the end as a sort of concession. But yeah, so essentially it's just having a look at the new features in .NET Core 3 and using them. So each chapter is an independent project. So you're using them to create a project. So that in the first chapter, I'm sort of, interestingly, based on what we just talked about, creating a new WinForms app. And then I take the WinForms app that was written for the previous edition and upgrade that. And then, in subsequent chapters, have a look at things like Azure Logic apps and Entity Framework, various different bits and bobs. So yeah, it's the first book that I've written, and I would definitely encourage people, if they're so inclined and they sort of like writing, to write a book about tech, because it's difficult. You spend a lot of time writing it, but and it's a lot of time you could be doing other stuff, but you learn a lot. And interestingly, when you tell people, you get in touch with people at Microsoft and you say, I'm writing a book, can you help me out? I've not had a bad response. People have really put themselves out and sort of helped me out with all kinds of different things. And yeah, they sort of, I mean, Microsoft in general, with my experience, have been, even outside of the book, have been quite helpful. And I don't know if this has always been the case. Everyone says it's a new Microsoft, but I've never really had a bad experience with guys there. So it's a positive thing to do, I think.
That's cool. I like that. It does echo the sort of sentiment that I've had so far from other guests who've worked alongside Microsoft and asked for help, and colleagues and clients that I've worked with who have in the past been in direct contact with Microsoft. There's a client that I recently worked with who said that they were building something for Xamarin and were in direct contact with, for instance, James Montemagno, and they had like weekly calls discussing how they were going to make the next part of the app, because it was a Xamarin app and what they were doing was not really supported in Xamarin. So whilst the folks who were making the app were breaking new ground with that, the folks who work on the Xamarin teams were like, well, we need to create a bunch of libraries to help them do that. So it was like this really cool collaborative process. Yeah, a couple of the guests who've been on the show previously have said the same thing. I've been writing this book or this series of tutorials, and I had to be in touch with Microsoft, and they seem to be really open and nice about helping me out and stuff, which is it's a nice change from the previous publicity that Microsoft have had, from the 90s and the early 2000s. But I suppose the problem is that one bad report is really all you need, to create that sort of negative feeling.
I mean, everyone's sort of saying they've changed, and to be honest, I suppose it's. I think part of that is they're doing things a lot more in the open these days. I mean, like I say, maybe they have changed. Maybe everyone there before was, some kind of dragon or something, and then it's changed, and they're all like really nice guys now. But I mean, I've spoken to Microsoft before, even prior to sort of 2000, and the guys I spoke to have always been helpful on the support desk, and that was pre sort of Twitter days, when you can just sort of go on Twitter and find out who's got experience of this and just kind of send them a direct message and go, I'm doing this, have you got any advice? And but yeah, I had one of the guys who works on the XAML team, I was talking to him. He was extremely helpful. He was sort of showing me early versions of the demos that they were doing and so on, and passing all that sort of stuff through. And when it come to working on chatbots, the same sort of thing. I got in touch with a guy, and he immediately said, "Can we have a call?" Taught me through something, gave me some tips. So yeah, it's really useful. So I can't really say a bad thing about Microsoft at all.
I guess there's two questions here. What kind of projects are in the book, and are they geared more towards, I've never used .NET Core or C# 8, and I want to know how to make an app that I can put on the web somewhere? Is that the kind of idea you're going with?
Yeah, so it's it does have quite a beginner feel to it. So I'm sort of answering the second part of your question first there, but yeah, it has sort of a beginner feel to it. So you need some basic sort of programming experience. It's definitely going to help you if you've programmed in C# before. There's certainly nothing in the book that sort of teaches you how to program in C#. But yeah, as a sort of novice C# developer, you could pick it up and sort of run with it. The sort of projects are supposedly real world examples. So, obviously these things have not actually been requested by a client or anything, but they sort of imagined real world examples. So for example, we've got a chat application using Azure SignalR just to sort of demonstrate how SignalR works and with .NET Core 3 and so on. And then, using Entity Framework Core, a sort of tool helps you sort of identify websites that are quite useful. Things like that, just trying to put it into context. So I know one of the things that I've always found useful, maybe not so much in IT, but in sort of academia generally, is, I was always the person who, in the maths class in school, wanted to know, why are we doing this? What is it you use this trigonometry for? Because until I can sort of get my head around that, just teaching me all this is the sum that you use to kind of calculate that, it doesn't mean anything. And then interestingly, you start writing games and so on, you're like, that's what it's all for.
Yeah, like to use one of your examples, SignalR is kind of useless by itself, but if you need some kind of real-time bidirectional communication between an application and a server, it's wonderful for it. So yeah, that, I guess the chatbot idea is kind of like a wonderful example of how that all fits together.
Yeah, and hopefully it's a useful resource for people. Like I say, it certainly helped me.
Where is it best to get the book from? Is it Pact Publishing? Can I get it from Amazon? Is there a website? What's the best place to find out more about it?
Yes, so yeah, you can get it from Pact, or Packet as I've been referring to them. I don't know what the correct pronunciation is, if I'm honest. You can also get it from Amazon, and I can send you a link to it so you can put it in the show notes, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah. We'll put the link in the show notes, definitely, and that way, we don't have to. Listeners aren't scrambling for a piece of paper or to get their phone out whilst potentially driving or something. We don't want to be the cause of car crashes, do we?
Definitely not, no. or cycling, as I normally listen to your podcast.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I tend to listen to all of my shows that I subscribe to when I'm doing practically anything. As long as I can be left alone by friends and family and colleagues, I just get on with it. I'm one of these weirdos who can do the listening to podcasts and take it all in and do the work that they're doing at the same time.
Yeah, that's not me. I can't concentrate on anything, and then so it has to be something that don't need concentration. And I mean, obviously, when I say not concentration, I'm not cycling and not concentrating on the road.
It's that automaticity, isn't it? You kind of, you don't have to devote all of your brain power to making the bike go and making sure that you're safe on the road.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Then you factor into it that I listen to most podcasts at 1.75 times normal speed, or 2 times speed, or sometimes 3 times speed. Then it usually all just goes in, which is, I'm a weirdo, is what I'm saying. But yeah, so we'll put the link to where to get the book from in the show notes. Is there a website for it, or is it just a case of check out the book and then are there source code samples on GitHub and stuff like that?
Yeah, so basically, you get the book from Packet or Pact or Amazon, and then there's a GitHub repository with all of the examples in, which is obviously referenced in the book. So yeah, you can sort of get everything from there.
Excellent. Okay. So what about yourself then? If folks want to keep in touch with you or find out more about what you're sort of doing, what you're up to, is that something that's okay? You know, not everyone has a Twitter and a blog, but, you know, is that something you do?
Yes, it is. So you can find me on Twitter at Paul_Michaels. So yeah, feel free to get in touch with me. You can find me on LinkedIn. If you just search for Paul Michaels, I imagine I'll be one of the early results. And I maintain a blog which I sort of post to relatively frequently, which is pmichaels.net. Yeah, I think that's pretty much all the ways that you can get in touch with me.
So yeah, what I'll do is I'll make sure I put links to all of those things in the show notes. What was the book title again? Sorry.
Book title is C#8 and .NET Core 3 projects using Azure.
Well, I mean, that's all the questions I have today. Thank you ever so much for spending part of your Saturday afternoon chatting .NET Core and desktop technologies and WinForms and Azure and stuff with me, because it's been really eye-opening. There's been some stuff that I definitely didn't know going in, and now I know a lot more. So thank you ever so much for that.
Well, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to have a chat. And I can think of a few better ways than spending a Saturday afternoon than going on about tech, which probably makes me a bit of a strange person as well.
That was my interview with Paul Michaels. Be sure to check the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show, and there will be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to .netcore.show/subscribe for ways to do that, and to come back next time for more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks. The .NET Core podcast is a production of RJJ Software Limited.